tomorrow it's going to be 68 in here?
No,
Is that
it's
what normally
it's
is?
like 62 on that paper.
What
Oh,
paper?
wait, 62. That was 62, you're right. For the agenda for tomorrow?
Oh, the agenda? We're going to begin in
I want to be 62, so I'm pumped. So like, she made it 68.
Okay, good. That's like great. Impasse with blankets. And
We're not going to be sweating.
jackets.
Well, I don't sweat.
You don't?
Mm-mm.
That was into the microphone. We're live.
I really, like, when I work out, when I go to the gym and stuff, people come out, like, just drenched.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not like I don't sweat, but I'm not, like, it ain't dripping off my face. All right, let's get started. We ask for the courtesy of the board members, staff, and members of the public that you please silence your phone for the whole four of you that are in the audience today. Good morning and welcome to the Orange County School Board's Rule Development Workshop for Tuesday, October 15th, 2024. The Rule Development Workshop has been scheduled today for the purpose of discussing proposed revisions to the following policies: School Board Policy BG, School Board Policies and Policy Process, School Board Policy FF, Naming or Renaming Schools, Building, and Facilities. During this rule development workshop, the school board welcomes public comment on the proposed revisions to the aforementioned school board policies. Because this is not a regularly scheduled school board meeting, there will be no non-agenda period in which the public normally addresses the school board on germane topics that are related to the work of the board. Should you wish to address the school board on another topic, please do so this evening at our next regularly school board meeting open public comment period. Thank you for being with us today. So let's do a quick roll call. I know that member Salamanca is in the building, so I expect her to come shortly. Member Front.
I'm here.
Member Gould. Good morning. I am present. Member Felder, is Member Felder on the line? Member Felder will be calling in. We'll check on her in a little bit. Chair Jacobs.
Present. Well, not really, but here.
You're here telephonically.
Here.
That's great.
Yep.
Member Dr. Castro-Dental.
Right here.
Member Byrd.
Good morning.
Good morning. So we do have a quorum. As a reminder, board members will not be engaging in outside electronic or digital communication during the meeting, so we can focus on matters immediately before us. To my fellow board members, district staff, and members of the public, when speaking, please make sure that your microphone is turned on and speak directly into it so our YouTube and Orange TV viewers can hear you clearly. Again, thank you so much for participating in or attending today's meeting. Now we're going to have a moment of silence followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. And now for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The first policy that up today is policy BG, School Board's Policy and Policy Process. Dr. Vasquez.
Thank you, Vice Chair Gallo. The board met on this particular policy just a few weeks ago, gave staff feedback on certain sections. Our staff has gone back, done some of those revisions. Our General Counsel, Palmerini, will be presenting to the board, and then you will have an opportunity to have discussion and ask questions.
Thank you, Madam Superintendent, Madam Chair, members of the board. We're going to start with policy BG, which is the school board policies and policy process. It's sort of a meta discussion of a policy about a policy, but here we go. As you will remember, in section 1, we just made the change of 28 to 21 days for the notice of the public hearing. That's in compliance with the law. What was in there was not statutorily correct. And then going down to section 3, it was technical changes, but everywhere else in the policy we referred to them as technical corrections, so we made change to correction. And then in section 8, policy exemptions for changes in law, and this is where we made changes coming out of it. So I'm just going to read you what we did. So this talks about when, there's a change in the law, the policy is deemed amended to comply with the law. And then the policy addition says such action is required by section 120.528C, which prohibits policies which contravene the specific provisions of law implemented. And this was the change. You all were concerned, is it a technical change? Is it a substantive change? And how do we differentiate between the two? So this is what we came up with. If the General Counsel believes a change in policy to comply with law is a technical correction, the General Counsel shall send a proposed change to the board and seek its guidance at a subsequent public meeting regarding whether the board agrees the change is technical. So how we described it in the previous meeting was, I would send you an email saying, here's what I propose to be a technical correction, and then I would, in my attorney's report at a regularly scheduled meeting or in a work session, say, members of the board, I've sent you a policy change which I believe to be a technical correction. Do you all agree it's a technical correction? It's that I get consensus of the board, yes or no. And then if the board agrees, going back to the language of the proposed policy, if the board agrees the change is technical, then the General Counsel shall place a resolution on the non-consent agenda for adoption at a subsequent school board meeting without going through the normal policy adoption procedure. You all wanted the technical changes still to be on the non-consent agenda, so it would allow for discussion in case you all needed that discussion. If the board gives guidance that it believes the change is substantive, then the policy change will go through the normal process of a work session, rule development workshop, and final adoption after a public hearing. I think that is what the board came up with as consensus the last time we were here, and that's the last portion of the change in this policy, and I will open it up to any questions the board may have.
Thank you, Mr. Palmerini. Member Dr. Kessler-Dental.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
That I didn't consider the last time we spoke about this. When we have policy changes or recommendations, we normally go through a process where we notify the union.
Yes.
Would that still be the case when we're looking at these technical changes? We would be letting them know, not just after the fact,
No.
but after you notify the board, and then they would be notified as well.
Yeah, that would not change. The notification of the union was pursuant to a settlement agreement that, good Lord, it's probably been 10 or 12 years ago now, and that we've consistently followed and will continue to consistently follow it, even with technical changes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Member Castro-Dental. I want the record to reflect that Member Felder is now on the line with us. Good morning, Member Felder.
Good morning, everyone.
Wonderful. Does anybody else wish to speak? Does anybody that is on the phone with us wish to speak to this policy? Member Felder, Chair Jacobs?
Thank you, Vice Chair, or Chair. Only to comment, John, great job on the drafting and incorporating the concept that any communication back to you regarding this policy would be done in a very transparent fashion. I think it's excellent, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And I would like to thank John for his work and the fact that we have an opportunity to discuss, the policy sometimes when they come on, if you make it on the non-agenda. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Felder.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. So we just need consensus to move it forward, or do we need a vote, John?
No, just consensus.
Do we have consensus to move this policy forward? I see shaking heads. Member Felder, Chair Jacobs, do we have consensus?
Yes, yes.
My head is shaking.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. We'll take that.
Or nodding, whatever that is.
And we had nobody to speak before us, correct? Just for the record, I know we didn't, but there was no speakers. Okay. Just so that the public is aware. All right, we're going to move on to policy FF, naming or renaming school buildings and facilities. Dr. Vasquez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This policy revision also came before the board a few weeks ago, and several changes were recommended by members of the board. Staff has gone back, made the additional changes. I believe this captures the spirit of what was shared at that time. General Counsel John Pomerini will present to the board those changes.
Thank you, Madam Superintendent. So starting off with this policy, it was naming or renaming of schools, buildings, and facilities, and real property. So as we explained previously, real property is the actual dirt on the ground. And so sometimes people would want to name a section of the actual ground for after somebody. So we were including that in the policy. So you'll see real policy added in anywhere it says new schools, buildings, or facilities. Previously, real properties added onto it. So starting with number 2, new schools, buildings, facilities, or real property may be named after persons still living if the board votes by supermajority vote to do so. The board may name a new school, buildings, facilities, or real property after a person who's deceased. The naming of a new school, building, facility, or real property after any person shall ensure that the person had a substantial impact on public schools. I went back and listened to the meeting, and I think that is the phrasing upon which we landed. So, Madam Chair, do you mind if I just stop at every section to see if there are questions?
Are there any questions regarding the first paragraph? Are we good online? Chair Jacobs, Member Fox?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful. I just want, and I know that it's in there for people to read, but for those who are listening, if you are, we're still taking input from the community. Like, that changes none of that. The input, the community will all have a say before it comes to the board and the board makes its final decision.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. All right, Section 3. This deals with existing schools, buildings, facilities, or real property. In order to rename an existing school, building, facility, or real property, community stakeholders, as defined in this policy, and we'll get to the definition at the next section, comprising of at least 20% of the student population, must indicate written support for such renaming. If the required threshold to rename an existing school, building, facility, or real property is met, and such renaming is approved by Cabinet and the School Advisory Council, the superintendent shall present the board with the existing name and one alternative name. Input on the alternative name from the community stakeholders shall be included in the presentation, including the number and percentage of votes for each alternative. Existing schools, buildings, facilities, or real property may be named after persons still living if the board votes by supermajority vote to do so. The board may name an existing school, buildings, facility, or real property after a person who's deceased. The naming of an existing school, building, facility, or real property after any person shall ensure that the person had a substantial impact on public schools. So let me just explain a couple things in there. The 20% of the student population for community stakeholders. Community stakeholders, as you'll see, is not only the students, it's parents, it's community members within the various area, alumni. So because I'm math challenged, if a school has 1,000 students, then it would require, a written assent of 200 folks to rename an existing facility. And we had the example last time of like Taylor Swift High School. So the choke point there on if we were going to do something like that is even if we got 20% of the community stakeholders saying this is what we wanted to do with it, the renaming would also have to be approved not only by the School Advisory Council, but it would have to come to Cabinet too. So there are ways to ensure that we don't have a name that may not properly reflect somebody who had a substantial impact on public schools, getting a school or an existing school building or facility named after them. We also had concerns that when we were giving the the input of from the community stakeholders on the alternative name, saying the community supported this name. We weren't identifying what level of support it was, so this policy would require the number and percentage of votes for each alternative that's presented as an alternative name for the existing building. And then it maintains the supermajority requirement to name it after a person who's living. So those are the contours of it, and I'll open it up to any questions the board may have.
Member Front.
I think the only thing I would comment as well is just that it also, they need to have, maybe you said this and I missed it, but just that substantial impact on the public schools.
Yes.
So even if like Taylor Swift High School came into play, when it comes to us, we'd say, well, what impact has she had on this high school? And then it wouldn't go through.
Yes, ma'am. The substantial impact on public schools is still in the last sentence, just like it was in the previous section.
Thank you, Member Front. Any other questions? You have a question? Member Dr. Castro-Dental?
Yes. Would this policy, as it's written now, prevent us from naming a school Roberto Clemente, even though we already have one? But would that have prevented that?
The person would have to have a substantial impact on public schools. So I know, for example, in the Azalea Park community, you have the Azalea Park Little League fields that had the Roberto Clemente mural on there. And so that may be something that the community stakeholders may say was representative of public schools, but he didn't really have anything to do with our public schools down here. So maybe going forward, probably not. Would be the answer to your question, that, yeah, it would probably have prevented Roberto Clemente from being so named.
I wonder if there should be some exception for a judgment call.
I mean, we can certainly do that. It would require us to go back through the policy-making process and start it over.
Right.
So we can do that if that's the board's desire.
So I share Member Castro-Dental's concerns on this, because when we renamed the school Roberto Clemente, it was because overwhelmingly the public came to us and that was the name they wanted, because while he may not have had a substantial impact on public schools, he had a substantial impact on the community that attends those schools. So maybe we could have some leeway, like if that person had a substantial impact on the community and the community are the folks attending the school, then that should be taken into consideration. And I don't know how we would reword that.
School or community?
So there's a couple possible ways to do it, right? Either we go back through the entire process and start it over, or, and when we have final adoption, if we were to, for example, have public comment that would say, we're arguing in favor of giving some leeway here, we could make a change at the final hearing in response to the public comment. So we could let this policy go through as is for now, hear it on the 29th. If we get public comment on the 29th, we can make the change at that time. If we don't get public comment on the 29th, we can come back and run that particular change just through the policy process. Either way would work, and I'm at the pleasure of the board.
The board's lit up, but I'm going to go to the superintendent first, just in case she can offer clarity.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to, first of all, make sure I am looking at Section 3 of the policy,
Yes,
the
ma'am.
very last line.
Yes, ma'am.
So it says substantial impact on public schools, not the school. So when you look at Roberto Clemente and his foundation, it has done tremendous work to support public schools, public education, not necessarily here, although I do believe that the foundation also helped contribute to not just the baseball fields, but to some mentoring and after-school activities. So it doesn't say the particular school, it says public schools. And I think that gives us the leeway to be able to allow the individual, it doesn't necessarily have to be that school, but public schools. Now, if the board wants it to include anyone that may not have had an impact on public schools, then yes, we need to change the verbiage.
Thank you, Dr. Vasquez. Member Gould.
I think the superintendent kind of addressed what I wanted, but I do think the board, if there is a large community movement, and in the case of a Roberto Clemente, this is a great example, that may be a hero in a community where the school should have the ability to take that input and override the policy. So does the policy allow for the board to still have the final decision on the naming? I mean, I know we can at any time, but is it written in there that the board can, in extreme circumstance, decide not to follow this guideline?
Yeah, it does not have notwithstanding anything in the foregoing, the board reserves the right to name a facility whatever it wants. I'm not trying to be flip with the way I say it, but it would be something akin to that. It doesn't have that in there. That would be required we would have to wordsmith something like that.
Yeah. Do we need it? I guess, and now I'm asking a general counsel question. The board still always has the authority to override any policy at any minute, right?
You're supposed to comply with your policies as written. You can make exceptions to your policy. Like I'm just trying to think of, for example, let's say it was something, Roberto Clemente had no impact on public education, and I thank the superintendent for letting me know about the foundation because I was unaware of that, so I apologize for not knowing that. But let's say Roberto Clemente had no contact or substantial impact on public schools. The board could say, but we think he's a member of the community that deserves to have the school named after him, and then I would have to think, okay, who's going to file a challenge or bring a claim with respect to that for the violation of the policy? I just don't see that happening. Mm-hmm. Now, I can't sit here and tell you to not comply with your policy because you're supposed to comply with your policy.
No, I understand. My point is, though, if there is an exception, whether we write it into the policy or not, the board always has the ability to document why they would make an exception. Yeah. And have it discussed at the dais and do it. Okay.
That issue, Member Gould, is an extremely low legal risk of ever having a problem if the board were to say, you know what, we're documenting that the community wants this name, we're going to go ahead and do it.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Member Gould. Member Front.
Thank you. Dr. Vasquez, that was definitely helpful, your explanation. And I think, for me, it's the policy's written well the way it is. And with that explanation, I think they need to have some sort of impact on our public schools, like in education, I guess. So I guess we could say something like a substantial impact on education instead of public schools if we did want to go back for some sort of minor revision. But when you look at different people that the community might come together and say they want a Martin Luther King High School or something like that, he may not have had a direct impact, like come to one of our schools or been a parent in one of our schools, but his legacy lives on in our schools. And so for that reason, I think as long as they've had some sort of impact on education, that I feel like our policy is written well in that sense. So for me, I think I'm fine the way it is. But if we wanted to do any kind of minor revision to say education instead of public schools, I would be fine with that as well.
Thank you, Member Front. Member Byrd.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, we also have Sally Ride Elementary. So I think there are definitely examples where there's people that have made significant contributions to society and that are heroes in a sense and important people for our children to know about and for us to, honor in that way. So I think I would like to see something added, possibly education or community, or all three. You could say public schools, education, or community, either way. But I also do think that we need to go ahead with this just because I know we have some people that are waiting for this policy for some maybe. I have like 2 in my community. So I would like to see this go ahead and go through and then do what you said, wait and see if we get public comment or bring it back and add that to it. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Member Byrd. Chair Jacobs.
Thank you. This is one of those times when I really wish I was in the room for this conversation. I don't mean to be disagreeable, but I do think that our policy needs to authorize us to deviate from it if that is our intent. I support the idea of moving forward with what we have, and if we receive the feedback that would allow us to make changes, to consider the changes. I appreciate Member Castor-Dental bringing this forward because it had not entered my mind, but I think that's an excellent example of where we'd want that flexibility. One of the concerns that I have with the language that we have allowing us in the future to have named the school Roberto Clemente would be that it's the foundation and not him directly. So I think that could be easily remedied with it being the individual directly or indirectly impacting public schools. And I think that would give us a great deal more flexibility. When you're talking about indirectly, that's a pretty broad term. So I guess what I'm saying is, one, I don't think that I just disagree, John, and I don't think you would disagree with me on this, but I disagree with the concept that we can override our policies at any point in time. In an emergency situation, there is an avenue by which we can take action, but even with that, we have to bring our policy in line in a very short period of time. So I think the board needs to recognize that once we adopt the policies, they govern us as much as they govern our schools and our actions. It governs the board and tells us. So I think it's important, if we want flexibility, that we build it in. Again, I like the idea of moving this forward and seeing if we have that opportunity. And if not, we can always do like we've done before and put it back on the agenda for additional changes to consider the flexibility I think the board is looking for here, specifically the ability to be responsive to our community when it comes to naming schools.
Thank you, Chair
Over
Jacobs.
and out. Thank you.
Member Dr. Castle-Denton.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if we can, I think it's important that we don't wait to bring this back necessarily, or consider this at a later time. And I do think it's important that we don't tie the hands of the board or or anyone who is trying to go through the process that you've outlined here. There are already a lot of safeguards and people involved. I think we could give the board the flexibility by simply removing that last sentence, starting with the naming of an existing school, building, facility, or real property after any person that shall ensure that the person had a substantial impact on public schools. If we're already going through the process of community stakeholders, cabinet, the board, I think if there is someone that comes up like Taylor Swift, that would be knocked down along that process. If there is someone else in the community who they would like to name a school or a building after, I think that process allows for that check and balance. I don't think we have to say they have to have that public school relation.
Thank you, Dr. Castrogentle. So let's, so there's two things that are really on the table that I need help with. One is, are we going to move it, do we have consensus to move it forward as is, understanding that if someone were to speak to the board at a board meeting and ask us to change that wording, we do have the ability under policy to do so. The other thing in front of us is, how do we want to change it when it comes back? So maybe if we decide to move it forward, we have time to flesh the second out and don't need to discuss that here. John, thoughts?
Yeah, I think if we move, I would want to react to what I would get on October 29th, which is when this thing is going to be finally adopted. Because you all could have public comment, and then you all at the table could say, I think we want the language to be X. And whatever X is, I may look at that and say to the board, based upon whatever that X change is, I think it encompasses everybody's goals as stated, and we don't need to come back. So, yeah, that I would like to see what comes out of October 29th. And if something doesn't come out of October 29th and nobody speaks to it, then I got the understanding of the board and what they're trying to accomplish. I am going to need some sort of consensus on, like, for example, Dr. Castrodentle's last suggestion of eliminating the last sentence. I would need to know if that's the consensus of the board or not, right? So that's that. I would need that guidance going forward, but I don't think we need to make that decision today, per se. I think we just see what comes out of October 29th.
Thank you, Mr. Palmerini. Member Castrodental?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So at that next meeting, what would bring that up? A person just speaking during public comment, or an email that they send for public comment? What qualifies as a?
So it's either one of those two. So you all receive public comment via email before each one of your board meetings. It gets sent to you by your staff. That would be, if you remember when we had the pepper spray issue and the gentleman sent the public comment in on that, I advise you we've received public comment and you can make a change based upon that. One, or two, if they want this public hearing that we have on the policy for its final adoption, if somebody signed up to speak in that public hearing, that would also constitute public comment for the purpose of making a change.
Follow up?
Absolutely.
So if someone were to make a comment about another part of the policy, like we don't think it should go to the community stakeholders, they wouldn't do that. But would we be able to address that part that we're discussing, or do they have to talk about just that part we're discussing right now?
So my advice is going to be, if they don't reference the, substantial impact on public schools, just to use as an example, if they don't reference that and they just talked about community stakeholders, I would advise you that you're not really going to be able to touch that substantial impact on public schools. That comment needs to encompass the change that you're going to make.
Okay, and one more question. Public comment means anyone outside of the school district, a parent, a community member?
Yeah.
Who does?
All of those.
Teacher?
Yeah, anybody who comes to sign up to speak, that is a district employee, a non-district employee, member of the community, whoever signs up to speak would be public comment.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Member Castrodental. Yes, Superintendent, Dr. Vasquez.
I want to clarify, does written comment also count? So if we receive an email from a constituent that comments on any part of the policy, the board gets that, and that's also considered public comment, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Are there any other questions? I would argue that if someone brings, Chair Jacobs, okay, I'm going to be with you in 1 second, Chair. I would argue that if you open up a particular section, like if Section 3 is opened up for discussion, then it should open up the entire section, like it would open up an entire statute for conversation. So, well, no, John said it had to be specific to that one sentence. And I'm saying, well, if they're going to comment on Section 3 of this policy, it opens up all of Section 3 for a discussion and maybe a revision.
So that's where I get the heartburn, because at that, you're supposed to be responding to the public comment that you receive. That's the whole reason why you have these meetings, is the public's coming in saying, I think the policy should be X or Y. Well, if the public addresses Z but doesn't address X or Y, for then you all to make that change on X or Y, it's bypassing what would be the normal policy process.
Okay, thank you. Chair Jacobs.
I know this was a difficult moment at one of our board meetings on this, but I think the group of people that are not the public are the board. So I just want us to remember, I think at one point we were told that any one of us is also the public. But I also agree that employees of Orange County Public Schools are definitely the public. The one caution I would give is that I also agree, John, that if during the emails that we receive that are specifically comments to the board for the board meeting, the ones that we are given by the staff that come to us in that time frame would represent public comment. I'm not so sure that you can say that any email that you've received from anybody on this topic is a public comment. But anyway, I wanted your input on that.
So my presumption of, I wasn't thinking of any email that you all received. My thought was, you're getting an email from a member of the public that says, hey, I see you're considering policy FF at your next meeting. I think FF should not have that the person had a substantial impact on public schools. That's what I was thinking of, not just a general email you received at any given time. I think it needs to be I don't disagree with you, it needs to be within the period that you all receive public comment in preparation for your board meeting. And quite frankly, given the time frame between now and whenever the deadline is, the Monday before that school board meeting, we're going to get the public comment, and that to me would constitute the comment that you all could rely upon to make a change on October 29th.
John, thank you. I totally agree with you. And I don't remember who I heard in this conversation, but somewhere I picked up that like any email that we've received referencing this would count as public comment. But I think it needs to be clear in that communication that it's referencing our policy change considerations. So I think I would be very surprised, given the subject of Roberto Clemente, that the members of the community that really led this campaign, if you will, if they realized that we were talking about a policy that would have prevented that type of change in the future, I would be surprised if we don't hear from them, either via email or in person at our meeting, because I know how important this was to them. I think Member Casterdental, again, I really thank you for bringing this forward, because I think it's important to all of us.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, Mr. Palmery.
I just wanted to make one thing clear with respect to the policy. This will operate prospectively. It will not change any existing name of any school that we have. So like, there's no danger that Roberto Clemente the name would come off, but I know you all on the board know it. Just want to make sure anybody in the public is listening will know that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Palmery. And if we are to get, say, we get an email from somebody, all 7 of us or all 8 of us, get an email from someone in that time period that you mentioned, all we would need to do is give it to you. You could enter it into public record, even though they didn't submit it through the public comment. We could just give you that email and say, this was in the time allotted, please submit this to public record, so that we would be able to discuss it, correct?
Yeah, I'm sort of a substance over form person when it comes to that. If the intent of the person sending in the email is to register their comment there, I would find a way to make sure that it got to the correct person and in the correct format to get there, because I think what ultimately controls here is what's the public's input on it, and not whether they send it to the correct email address.
Thank you, Mr. Palmerini. Dr. Vasquez?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was going to speak to that and clarify. Chair Jacobs, I'm the one that made the comment about the email, and I was speaking to emails that they would receive after this, or actually they could be receiving it now during our session. It would be pertinent. And what I was trying to delineate is that the conversation Mr. Palmerini was having really spoke to public comment where they are in person, and I wanted to clarify that an email during the allotted time period it also constitute public comment. But when I buzzed in, it was to say, if you do receive an email, this is the process we want you to follow so that it does get entered into the public record. And whether it's an email that only one board member received or all of them, we want to be able to capture that.
Thank you, Dr. Vasquez. All right, so at this point, we're looking for consensus to move it forward as is, with the understanding that if nobody approaches the board on the 29th to make a change, that it will come back to the board with the change. Are we good? Do we have consensus? Salamanca? All right, Chair Jacobs?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. Member Felder?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Thank you. All right, Mr. Palmerini, you have consensus.
Okay. Now on number 4, we've defined community stakeholders, includes staff of the school, students attending the school, parents of legal guardians of students attending the school, community members with attachment to the school, and we give examples of parent-teacher association or similar group, because you have PTAs, PTOs, PTSAs, PTSOs, and a member of the school advisory council or alumni. We wanted to give them the opportunity, and neighbors with property in the school's attendance zone. So that's who we're defining as community stakeholders, and I'll open it up for any questions that the board has.
I don't see any questions from the board.
Thank you. All right, section 5A, we're just adding in real property where we had school building or facility previously. And then section 5B, individual rooms on campus. The board delegates the naming of individual rooms on campuses, i.e. cafeteria, libraries, media centers, or offices, exclusive of stadia, gymnasium, performing arts centers. Again, that's the one where we have the naming rights policy. And that authority will be given to the superintendent or designee to rename individual rooms on campuses. Superintendent or designee may name fields or press boxes within stadia, courts within gymnasia, or stages within performing arts center for persons under this provision. So, for example, like I gave the example last time, Apopka High School Stadium was Roger Williams Field, but they may be getting a sponsor under the naming policy, so it'll be that sponsor's name, stadium, at Roger Williams Field. So that's how that would work. Or if you had the longtime chorus director at a school, it may be insert the chorus director's name here, stage, at the Apopka High School Performing Arts Center, just as an example. The same process for renaming existing schools, buildings, facilities, and real property is applicable to individual rooms on campuses, with the exception of board approval. So again, this would be one of those where we get notification from the community stakeholders, 20% of them, that we want to rename individual room on campus. It will get reviewed by cabinet and the school advisory council to make sure that it's something that's appropriate for that school, and then it would go to the superintendent or her designee for the renaming, and it would not come back to you all for approval. Individual rooms on campuses may be named after persons who are still living. Any renaming, of an individual room on campus shall ensure that the person had a substantial impact on public schools Once again, if that language ends up changing on October 29th, I would anticipate it would change in every section where we have substantial impact on public schools. The superintendent or designee reserves the right to remove a name given to an individual rooms on campus if, in the judgment of the superintendent or designee, continuing to name the individual room on campus would bring adverse attention and publicity to the district and/or the school board. So we name it after a person, that person later commits multiple crimes, then the superintendent has the authority to say, yeah, we're not going to name that room after that person anymore. So any questions on this provision?
Thank you, Mr. Pomerany. I actually have a question. So basically, this section is stating that any rooms on any campus that are named, whether they be by a sponsor or by a person that had substantial impact in the community or in that school, will be made by the superintendent, and the board has no authority over that. Is that correct?
For individual rooms, yes.
For individual rooms, the board has no
Yeah.
authority.
Yeah, this was designating that to the superintendent.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on that. Do we have any questions regarding B? Are we good, Chair Jacobs?
Yes.
Yes, that's a question, or you have a question, or yes, that's consensus.
You know, I'm good with it. I think, obviously, I trust this superintendent, but this policy could be in place in the future with a different superintendent. The only thing, I mean, I obviously I can be okay with it. The board is okay with it. I think my preference would be that the superintendent has that authority unless the board determines or directs otherwise, that there be at least a way that the board could override that decision. Not that it comes to the board automatically, but that a board member having opposition or concern about it could bring it forward to the board, and the board could make a different decision. I think the board probably indirectly has that authority, but again, Dr. Vasquez, obviously that has nothing to do with you. I just think that giving kind of an unfettered right to a future superintendent to name a classroom could potentially be problematic. Is there a way, am I overreaching in terms of my understanding, John, of that language?
So, Madam Chair, it would still go through the process where the SAC and the cabinet would have to sign off on it here, so it's not unfettered there. You're right that there is nothing in the actual policy itself that says the board can override the superintendent's decision. I would anticipate that, if you all were having, the board in the future was having a discussion about a particular name, if it bubbled up in the community, the board could give its, its consensus or its thoughts to the superintendent saying, hey, we think, the majority of us think that continuing to name this room after that person is probably not appropriate, and I would suspect that the superintendent would be responding in the way the board would be directing there, but there is nothing specifically in the policy that says that.
Thank you. Follow up? Chair?
Absolutely, Chair.
Yeah, John, thank you. And, as I'm thinking about this with an appointed superintendent, I think it would be extremely unlikely that that would ever be an issue. And frankly, if we had an elected superintendent, it probably wouldn't be an issue either, because if it were something that was really controversial, I don't think either an appointed or elected superintendent would probably do that. So disregard my comment, and I apologize for the waste of time.
Thank you, Chair Jacobs. I was actually thinking along your lines about appointed versus elected, because I could see an elected superintendent getting in, and the board then having no authority, and then that would make it a little bit more difficult. And the cabinet reports to the superintendent, so the cabinet, like going through the cabinet's not really a check balance for me because they report directly to the superintendent. I understand that it would go through the SAC. I've served on many SACs, and a lot of times, unfortunately, they're just the rubber stamp for the principal. It depends on who's sitting on there. So I'm a little bit hesitant, not under our current makeup, not under our current administration, obviously, but if things were to change. But I would imagine that if we were to ever go from an appointed to an elected superintendent, I have a feeling there would be hundreds of policies coming before us rather quickly, and changes would be made. So I'm fine moving this forward. Member Kessler-Dental.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you clarify if this process, if a superintendent decided to change or rename a room on campus, would that come on our agenda before the board? Would it come on the consent agenda?
It would not, because you were, under the policy, you would be delegating authority to the superintendent. I suspect the superintendent, if she were to be renaming, he or she were renaming rooms, would inform the board, especially that board member, that, hey, we're renaming the room for this person. But I, of course, don't speak for the superintendent, so I will.
Could we put in there something about notifying the board so that we're aware, so that if there is something that bubbles up, we would be made aware? Otherwise, we may not know that a library is named after someone who is anti-reading.
So again, that would require, if we were going to do that, that's a change that we would, if we don't have public input on it, we would have to go back through the process. If we were to, for example, have public input on the 29th or in an email before the 29th, that could be something that could be added that way.
And I'm not opposed to going back through the process. So whatever, I think I'd rather just get this right as we're discussing it. So I don't know, whatever my colleagues decide, but I don't personally see any problem with going back through the process again. I don't think
I mean, going back through the process is no problem from my perspective. I think the direction we've previously gotten is this goes forward as is.
Right.
And then if we have to come back and make the changes, we most certainly do that. If on the 29th we're able to get public input that allows us to make the changes then and there without having to go back through the process, that would also be something we can do, and it quite frankly would be easier. That would mean a couple less meetings, and we still get it right. So.
True. I wonder, though, if this would be something that someone would comment on that I think the board should know. I don't know if it would rise to that level. I think this might be something that the board is requesting. So it doesn't end up creating any more meetings if going back to a change in the policy. If we were to just have a notification to the board, whatever format, whether it's consent agenda or in the board updates.
I think you all could
Could
direct.
that be done in, like outside of policy, could that be done in the manager, the directives, or whatever that's called?
Yeah, you all could just give direction to the superintendent at a meeting and say, hey, when you make a change to an individual room, just put it in the board update, and you could house it there. And I think that would be sufficient to where you don't have to put it in the policy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are you comfortable with that? Thank you. Chair Jacobs.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Chair. I was going down the same path. What I think would be better than board docs. And again, I agree. I don't think it needs to be in our policy, but the idea of the board being aware of it, I think is important. And I agree. I don't see why that has to be part of the policy. It can be a direction from the board. I think the appropriate place would be under information items, so that it's not on the agenda as a consent item that we approve, but it's in front of us in our meeting agenda to be aware of, as opposed to board docs, just because there's not board docs, the board updates, there's so much information there that it could be lost. And I think it's important enough that it should be, like I said, in front of the board in a more obvious way, and also to the public, because the public would have access to informational items that are attached to the agenda.
Thank you, Chair Jacobs.
John?
Great idea.
Okay.
John?
I think that's absolutely appropriate.
Are we all in agreement that it'll just put it under the information on the agenda? We're good with that? All right, I got a lot of yes. Okay. One more section.
And the last section is just adding real property in, so it's making it consistent with the rest of the policy.
Thank you, Mr. Palmerini. So we need consensus to move this policy on as written, with the understanding that if nobody comes before us on the 29th, that we will be revisiting this policy very quickly. Is everybody good with that? All right, I need consensus. Chair Jacobs?
I concur.
Thank you. Member Felder?
Yes, I concur, yes.
Wonderful. Mr. Palmerini, you have consensus.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I believe those are the only two policies we had before the board today, so seeing no further business, this meeting is adjourned. Did you need to make that announcement, John?